Section 14 of History of Egypt, Volume 1, by Gaston Maspero. Into the Public Domain. Chapter 2: The Gods of Egypt, Part 6. The lower offices in the households of the gods, as in princely households, were held by a troop of servants and artisans: butchers to cut the throats of the victims, cooks and pastry cooks, confectioners, weavers, shoemakers, florists, cellarers, water carriers, and milk carriers. In fact, it was a state within a state, and the prince took care to keep its government in his own hands, either by investing one of his children with the titles and functions of chief pontiff, or by arrogating them to himself. In that case he provided against mistakes which would have annulled the sacrifice by associating with himself several masters of the ceremonies, who directed him in the orthodox evolutions before the god and about the victim, indicated the due order of gestures and the necessary changes of costume, and prompted him with the words of each invocation from a book or tablet which they held in their hands. In addition to its rites and special hierarchy, each of the sacerdotal colleges thus constituted had a theology in accordance with the nature and attributes of its god. Its fundamental dogma affirmed the unity of the nome god, his greatness, his supremacy over all the gods of Egypt and of foreign lands, whose existence was nevertheless admitted, and none dreamed of denying their reality or contesting their power. The latter also boasted of their unity, their greatness, their supremacy; but whatever they were, the god of the nome was master of them all, their prince, their ruler, their king. It was he alone who governed the world, he alone kept it in good order, he alone had created it. Not that he had evoked it out of nothing: there was as yet no concept of nothingness, and even to the most subtle and refined of primitive theologians creation was only a bringing of pre existent elements into play. The latent germs of things had always existed, but they had slept for ages and ages in the bosom of Nu, of the dark waters. In the fullness of time the god of each nome drew them forth, classified them, marshalled them according to the bent of his particular nature, and made his universe out of them by methods peculiarly his own. Nit of Sais, who was a weaver, had made the world of warp and woof, as the mother of a family weaves her children's linen. Khnummu, the Nile god of the cataracts, had gathered up the mud of his waters, and therewith moulded his creatures upon a potter's table. In the eastern cities of the Delta these procedures were not so simple. There it was admitted that in the beginning earth and sky were two lovers lost in the Nu, fast locked in each other's embrace, the god lying beneath the goddess. On the day of creation a new god, Shu, came forth from the primeval waters, slipped between the two, and seizing Nuit with both hands, lifted her above his head with outstretched arms. Though the starry body of the goddess extended in space, her head being to the west and her loins to the east, her feet and hands hung down to the earth. These were the four pillars of the firmament under another form, and four gods of the four adjacent principalities were in charge of them. Osiris, or Horus the Sparrowhawk, presided over the southern, and Sit over the northern pillar, Thot over that of the west, and Sapdi, the author of the zodiacal light, over that of the east. They had divided the world among themselves into four regions, or rather into four houses, bounded by those mountains which surround it, and by the diameters intersecting between the pillars. Each of the houses belonged to one, and to one only; none of the other three, nor even the sun himself, might enter it, dwell there, or even pass through it without having obtained its master's permission. Sibu had not been satisfied to meet the irruption of Shu by a mere passive resistance. He had tried to struggle, and he is drawn in the posture of a man who has just awakened out of sleep, and is half turning on his couch before getting up. One of his legs is stretched out, the other is bent and partly drawn up as in the act of rising. The lower part of the body is still unmoved, but he is raising himself with difficulty on his left elbow, while his head droops and his right arm is lifted towards the sky. His effort was suddenly arrested. Rendered powerless by the stroke of the Creator, Sibu remained as if petrified in this position, the obvious irregularities of the earth's surface being due to the painful attitude in which he was stricken. His sides have since been clothed with verdure, generations of men and animals have succeeded each other upon his back, but without bringing any relief to his pain, he suffers evermore from the violent separation of which he was the victim when Nûît was torn from him, and his complaint continues to rise to heaven night and day. The aspect of the inundated plains of the Delta, of the river by which they are furrowed and fertilized, and of the desert sands by which they are threatened, had suggested to the theologians of Mendes and Buto an explanation of the mystery of creation, in which the feudal divinities of these cities and of several others in their neighbourhood, Osiris, Set, and Isis, played the principal parts. Osiris first represented the wild and fickle Nile of primitive times; afterwards, as those who dwelt upon his banks learned to regulate his course, they emphasized the kindlier side of his character, and soon transformed him into a benefactor of humanity, the supremely good being, Onofriu, Onophiros. He was the lord of the principality of Didu, which lay along the Sebennytic branch of the river between the coast marshes and the entrance to the Wady Tûmilât; but his domain had been divided, and the two nomes thus formed, namely, the 9th and 16th nomes of the Delta in the Pharaonic lists, remained faithful to him, and here he reigned without a rival, at Busiris as at Mendes. His most famous idol form was the Didu, whether naked or clothed, the fetish, formed of 4 superimposed columns, which had given its name to the principality. They ascribed life to this Didu, and represented it with a somewhat grotesque face, big cheeks, thick lips, a necklace round its throat, a long flowing dress which hid the base of the columns beneath its folds, and 2 arms bent across the breast, the hands grasping a whip and the other a crook, symbols of sovereign authority. This perhaps was the most ancient form of Osiris, but they also represented him as a man, and supposed him to assume the shape of rams and bulls, or even those of water birds, such as lapwings, herons, and cranes, which disported themselves about the lakes of that district. The goddess whom we are accustomed to regard as inseparable from him, Isis the cow, or woman with cow's horns, had not always belonged to him. Originally she was an independent deity, dwelling at Buto in the midst of the ponds of Adhu. She had neither husband nor lover, but had spontaneously conceived and given birth to a son, whom she suckled among the reeds, a lesser Horus, who was called Harsiasit, Horus the son of Isis, to distinguish him from Harohris. At an early period she was married to her neighbour Osiris, and no marriage could have been better suited to her nature. For she personified the earth, not the earth in general, like Sibu, with its unequal distribution of seas and mountains, deserts and cultivated land, but the black and luxuriant plain of the Delta, where races of men, plants, and animals increase and multiply in ever succeeding generations. To whom did she owe this inexhaustible productive energy, if not to her neighbour Osiris, to the Nile? The Nile rises, overflows, lingers upon the soil; every year it is wedded to the earth, and the earth comes forth green and fruitful from its embraces. The marriage of the 2 elements suggested that of the 2 divinities. Osiris wedded Isis and adopted the young Horus. But this prolific and gentle pair were not representative of all the phenomena of nature. The eastern part of the Delta borders upon the solitudes of Arabia, and although it contains several rich and fertile provinces, yet most of these owed their existence to the arduous labour of the inhabitants, their fertility being dependent on the daily care of man, and on his regular distribution of the water. The moment he suspends the struggle or relaxes his watchfulness, the desert reclaims them and overwhelms them with sterility. Sit was the spirit of the mountain, stone and sand, the red and arid ground as distinguished from the moist black soil of the valley. On the body of a lion or of a dog he bore a fantastic head with a slender curved snout, upright and square cut ears; his cloven tail rose stiffly behind him, springing from his loins like a fork. He also assumed a human form, or retained the animal head only upon a man's shoulders. He was felt to be cruel and treacherous, always ready to shrivel up the harvest with his burning breath, and to smother Egypt beneath a shroud of sifting sand. The contrast between this evil being and the beneficent couple, Osiris and Isis, was striking. Nevertheless, the theologians of the Delta soon assigned a common origin to these rival divinities of Nile and desert, red land and black. Sibu had begotten them; Nûît had given birth to them one after another, when the Demiurge had separated her from her husband, and the days of their birth were the days of creation. As a matter of fact, his companion, Nephthys, did not manifest any great activity, and was scarcely more than an artificial counterpart of the wife of Osiris, a second Isis who bore no children to her husband, for the sterile desert brought barrenness to her as to all that it touched. Yet she had lost neither the wish nor the power to bring forth, and sought fertilization from another source. Tradition had it that she made Osiris drunken, drawn him to her arms without his knowledge, and borne him a son; the child of this furtive union was the jackal Anubis. Thus when a higher Nile overflows lands not usually covered by the inundation, and lying unproductive for lack of moisture, the soil eagerly absorbs the water, and the germs which lay concealed in the ground burst forth into life. The gradual invasion of the domain of Sit by Osiris marks the beginning of the strife. Sit rebels against the wrong of which he is the victim, involuntary though it was; he surprises and treacherously slays his brother, drives Isis into temporary banishment among her marshes, and reigns over the kingdom of Osiris as well as over his own. But his triumph is short lived. Horus, having grown up, takes arms against him, defeats him in many encounters, and banishes him in his turn. The creation of the world had brought the destroying and the life-sustaining gods face to face; the history of the world is but the story of their rivalries and warfare. None of these conceptions alone suffice to explain the whole mechanism of creation, nor the part which the various gods took in it. The priests of Heliopolis appropriated them all, modified some of their details and eliminated others, added several new personages, and thus finally constructed a complete cosmogony, the elements of which were learnedly combined so as to correspond severally with the different operations by which the world had been evoked out of chaos and gradually brought to its present state. Heliopolis was never directly involved in the great revolutions of political history, but no city ever originated so many mystic ideas, and consequently exercised so great an influence upon the development of civilization. It was a small town built on the plain not far from the Nile at the apex of the delta, and surrounded by a high wall of mud bricks whose remains could still be seen at the beginning of the century, but which have now almost completely disappeared. One obelisk standing in the midst of the open plain, a few waste mounds of debris, scattered blocks, and 2 or 3 lengths of crumbling wall, alone mark the place where once the city stood. Ka was worshipped there, and the Greek name of Heliopolis is but the translation of that which was given to it by the priests, Pi Ra, city of the sun. Its principal temple, the mansion of the prince, rose from about the middle of the enclosure, and sheltered, together with the god himself, those animals in which he became incarnate, the bull Mnevis, and sometimes the phoenix. According to an old legend, this wondrous bird appeared in Egypt only once in 500 years. It is born and lives in the depths of Arabia, but when its father dies it covers the body with a layer of myrrh, and flies at utmost speed to the temple of Heliopolis, there to bury it. In the beginning, Ra was the sun itself, whose fires appear to be lightest every morning in the east and to be extinguished at evening in the west, and to the people such he always remained. Among the theologians there was considerable difference of opinion on the point. Some held the disk of the sun to be the body which the god assumes when presenting himself for the adoration of his worshippers. Others affirmed that it rather represented his active and radiant soul. Finally, there were many who defined it as one of his forms of being, Kopriu, one of his self-manifestations, without presuming to decide whether it was his body or his soul which he deigned to reveal to human eyes; but whether soul or body, all agreed that the sun's disk had existed in the Nu before creation. But how could it have lain beneath the primordial ocean without either drying up the waters or being extinguished by them? At this stage the identification of Ra with Horus and his right eye served the purpose of the theologians admirably. The god needed only to have closed his eyelid in order to prevent his fires from coming in contact with the water. He was also said to have shut up his disk within a lotus bud, whose folded petals had safely protected it. The flower had opened on the morning of the first day, and from it the god had sprung suddenly as a child wearing the solar disk upon his head. But all theories led the theologians to distinguish 2 periods, and as it were 2 beings in the existence of supreme deity, a pre-mundane sun lying inert within the bosom of the dark waters, and our living and life-giving sun. End of Section 14. Read by Professor Heather and By. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.